It was supposed to be a quiet Thursday night. No scandal, no politics, just a well-loved Hollywood icon plugging his latest action film. Nothing more than the usual blend of charm, humor, and pre-written anecdotes. And yet, what unfolded live on the Late Show stage that night was anything but routine. Mark Wahlberg didn't walk into a talk show. He walked into a trap, and he didn't know it. Not at first, not until it was too late. The crowd's cheer hit like clockwork, pre-programmed and obedient. Applause signs blinked in soft red at the edge of the camera frame. But in the sharp, scrutinizing silence behind Stephen Colbert's smile, something sinister was brewing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colbert announced with a grin so polished it gleamed. "Mark Wahlberg." Cue the crowd. Standing ovation. Some whistling from the back row. And yet, if you were watching closely, something was wrong. Colbert didn't rise to greet him. He didn't even glance up as Mark strode in, smiling that Boston-born, crowd-winning smile, the kind that usually melted hosts like butter under studio lights. Instead, Stephen shuffled through his cards like he was reviewing the autopsy report on a man not yet dead, and Wahlberg, he felt it. The temperature, the tightness in the air. He shook the host's hand anyway, sat down, leaned in with that well-practiced blend of humility and confidence. But before the first joke, the ambush began. Colbert cleared his throat. "Thanks for being here, Mark," he began, his voice polite, but something behind his eyes gleamed, too sharp to be casual. Wahlberg's brow tightened for just a split second. "Happy to be here, man." Colbert nodded slowly, then dropped it. "I have to ask, do you ever get tired of playing Mark Wahlberg in every movie?" The room didn't quite gasp, but it stopped breathing. Wahlberg blinked, smiled, laughed, just enough to give the benefit of the doubt. "Guess audiences like authenticity. I bring myself to every role, and people seem to connect with that." "Right," Colbert said, fake agreeing. "Or maybe it's just easier to play the same Boston tough guy again and again than actually act." Boom. The energy cracked like a live wire. Wahlberg shifted slightly in his chair, the charm starting to fade behind a steelier expression. "My filmography speaks for itself," he said carefully. "I've worked with amazing directors. I'm proud of the work." Colbert leaned forward, hands folded like a priest delivering judgment. "Sure, The Departed, right? A Boston cop, playing yourself with a badge." The studio laughed, but only a little, only nervously, and Wahlberg's face stopped moving altogether. "Listen," he said, voice tightening. "I've been doing this a long time. I work hard. I respect the craft." "That's rich," Colbert smirked, coming from Marky Mark. There it was, the name. The past Wahlberg had spent 20 years moving past, dragged back under the spotlight. He didn't take the bait. Not yet. "I was a kid," Wahlberg said, jaw clenched. "I've grown. I've apologized. I've tried to do better." "Oh, of course," Colbert said, mokogring again. "And now you get to sell your reformation to Hollywood, one fistfight movie at a time." More laughter, forced. Uneasy. The audience could feel it now. This wasn't banter. This was blood sport, and Wahlberg. He was done smiling. "Stephen," he said, voice low and dangerous, "if this is the direction you want to go, maybe we should talk about your career. Because tearing people down to look smart doesn't make you wise, just makes you a coward with a camera." Colbert blinked once, then twice, then smiled wider, coming from someone who dropped out of high school. There it was. Gasps rippled through the audience. Wahlberg froze. His face didn't twitch, but his hands were white-knuckling the armrests. "That's a cheap shot," he said. "Quiet." Ice-cold. Colbert leaned in. "Is it? Or is it context? Integrity's a big word, Mark. Maybe you should have stuck around school long enough to learn what it means." The air shattered. And Wahlberg sat up straighter, squaring his shoulders like he was about to stand. "You want to talk about pasts?" he snapped. "Let's talk about your history. You've built a career mocking people, hiding behind writers and applause signs. You tear down anyone who doesn't fit your echo chamber. But when someone pushes back, you play the victim." "Oh, I'm not playing anything," Colbert replied. "I just don't think the industry should keep giving starring roles to men with your kind of background." "Careful," Wahlberg warned. "Why," Colbert said, "you spent time in jail, right? Assault, wasn't it? Didn't you throw rocks at black schoolchildren while yelling slurs?" The room turned to ice. Dead silence. And then a single, "Oh my God," whispered from the crowd. Cameras panned slowly away. The floor manager stood frozen. One assistant dropped a clipboard. Audience members started pulling out their phones. Wahlberg's face was ash-white dot, then crimson, then pale again. "You're bringing that up," he said, voice shaking. "On national TV, is it not relevant?" Colbert shrugged. "You brought up redemption. I'm asking, do actions have consequences or not?" "I was 16, Wahlberg shouted. "A stupid kid. I've apologized. I've donated. I've worked in those communities. I've spent decades trying to make it right. And yet here you are," Colbert said flatly, "still benefiting from a system that forgave you because you were famous. If you were black, you'd still be in prison." The studio exploded, not with noise, but with tension. Like a collective scream swallowed too fast, Wahlberg stood up. Security shifted. Lights dimmed slightly. Producers began whispering behind the scenes. "You don't know me," Wahlberg said, pointing. "You sit here every night with your smug little jokes, pretending you care about justice, but you don't care about truth. You care about ratings. And yet, here you are," Colbert said smugly, "on my show begging for approval." "I came here to talk about my film," Wahlberg snapped. "Not get ambushed by a man too afraid to be honest about his own bitterness." "Bitterness," Colbert echoed. "You think I'm bitter?" "I think you're a hack with a grudge," Wahlberg snarled. "I think you're jealous because the world doesn't love you the way it used to. So now you sit here, night after night, hoping you can break people down before they expose you." The audience gasped again. Then a stage manager signaled frantically off camera. Then Colbert stood up and walked around his desk. It was no longer an interview. It was a standoff. "You want to talk about exposure," Colbert said darkly. "Let's talk about your sets. The tantrums, the screaming at crew, the threats. You think people haven't talked." "You're lying," Wahlberg said. "You're making this up." "Am I?" Colbert smirked. "Let's call your co-stars." "Let's ask them back the hell off," Wahlberg said. "Stay behind your desk." "Or what?" Colbert challenged, stepping closer. "Or gonna hit me? Prove me right." The studio fell silent. Security crept forward. A producer yelled into their headset, "Do we cut? Do we cut?" Wahlberg breathed heavy, but didn't swing. "I'm not that man anymore," he said through gritted teeth. "I changed. Can you say the same?" Colbert didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't back down. And that's when Wahlberg said the words that turned the room into fire. "You used to be funny. Now you're just cruel. You chose to be small instead of great. And that's something you'll have to live with long after tonight is forgotten." He tore off the mic, let it crash to the floor, and turned to leave. Wahlberg laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. "Is that really all you have left?" he asked, shaking his head. "An underwear joke from 30 years ago." The laughter in the audience came, but it wasn't on Colbert's side anymore. It was nervous, shaky, a crowd that had just realized the lion in the cage might have been the wrong one all along. Colbert, still standing center stage, no desk, no distance, suddenly looked smaller, exposed, and Wahlberg, the man they thought came in on the defense, looked like someone who had finally stopped running from ghosts. "I came on this show because I thought maybe, just maybe, this country was ready for real conversation," Wahlberg said, voice steady now, no longer shouting. "I thought maybe it was time to stop pretending that people are only good or evil, clean or dirty. That maybe redemption was still something worth believing in." He paused, swallowed hard. "But you weren't looking for redemption," he said. "You were looking for blood." Colbert tried to regain footing, voice sharp, too loud. "I was doing my job." "No, Stephen," Wahlberg said, voice dropping. "Your job was to talk. Your job was to listen, to challenge, not to crucify. But you don't want to understand people like me. You just want to put us in boxes so your audience can clap and nod and feel like they're on the right side of history." He walked back to center stage, not to confront Colbert, but to address the audience directly. "No one clapped for me when I tried to make peace with the people I hurt. No cameras rolled when I was building schools or helping kids get off the street. You know why? Because kindness doesn't trend. Only outrage does." Colbert cut in, arms crossed now, face unreadable. "So we should forget your past just because you built some schools." Wahlberg turned to him slowly. He said, "You shouldn't forget, but you should understand the difference between a man who's running from his past and a man who's walking straight into it, owning every broken piece of it, because that's the only way forward." The room felt suffocating now. Behind the glass were frozen. Phones in the audience were trembling in people's hands. But no one stopped filming. Not anymore. Not after this. Wahlberg took one more step toward Colbert. "This interview didn't go off the rails because of me," he said. "It went off the rails because you forgot the difference between holding someone accountable and punishing them for not staying in the role you assigned them." Colbert clenched his jaw. "You don't get to come on my show and lecture me." "I didn't come to lecture you," Wahlberg said. "Calm now. I came here thinking we were going to talk about a movie. You turned it into a trial. But here's the difference between you and me. Stephen, when you screw up, it gets buried in staff contracts and NDAs. When I screw up, it's a punchline on every late-night show for the next 10 years. A ripple through the audience again. Aghast, Colbert stepped back slightly, the words cutting deeper than he led on. "You sit in that chair every night and pretend you're the conscience of the country," Wahlberg continued. "But what you really are is afraid." Colbert flinched. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid," Wahlberg said, eyes narrowing, "that if you ever actually let your guard down, if you stopped being the smug guy with the snappy punchlines and the pre-written take on everything, people would see the man behind the curtain. And maybe, just maybe, you're scared they wouldn't like what they see." Silence again. A long, horrible, breathless silence. Even the cameramen were no longer moving. Even the director in the booth had stopped calling shots. Colbert stood there, stunned. No clever retort, no cue cards, no laughter sign. Just him and Wahlberg, and the raw truth hanging in the air like smoke. And then Wahlberg softened. His shoulders dropped. The adrenaline that had pushed him this far began to settle into weariness. "But I don't hate you," Wahlberg said quietly. "I pity you, because somewhere along the way, you stopped listening. And when a man stops listening, he stops learning." He turned again. This time, he didn't stop. He walked toward the curtain, past the stunned crew, past the interns who would never forget this moment for the rest of their lives. Colbert didn't call after him, didn't joke, didn't smirk. Just stood there alone on a stage that had suddenly never felt smaller. The crowd didn't clap, they didn't boo, they just watched and then cut the feed. Someone whispered in the control room, "Too late." The feed had already gone live. Across the country, Twitter exploded. YouTube auto-uploaded the entire segment. Reddit threads broke open like wildfire. The media machine roared to life. But something had shifted. This wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a reckoning. The studio lights were still on, but the air had shifted. Like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Colbert remained motionless, eyes staring at the curtain Wahlberg had just walked through. The hum of the audience was back. Not applause, not jeers, but stunned murmurs, the sound of collective disbelief. Like they'd just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Something real. Inside the control room, panic was setting in. Is the feed down? No, CBS is rerunning. It already? Where the hell is legal? This is gonna blow up. But out on the studio floor, Colbert still hadn't moved. His hands gripped the side of his desk. No cards, no coffee mug, no witty outro to save him now. He looked haunted, not humiliated, just deeply shaken. He knew it wasn't just about the interview anymore. It was what Wahlberg said right before he left. "You stopped listening." Those words echoed not just in his head, but online, on every feed, stitched onto reaction clips, trending under the hashtag Colbert collapse. Backstage. Wahlberg sat in a folding chair, his chest still rising and falling fast. He wasn't proud. He wasn't smug. He looked like a man who had just carried something heavy for too long and finally set it down. His publicist burst in. "Mark, you can't just walk off like that. You don't understand how this works." Wahlberg stood slowly. "I know exactly how it works. That's why I walked off." She followed him as he moved down the hallway. "They're going to paint it like you exploded, like you lost control." He stopped, turned to her. "Let them. At least I was honest." Meanwhile, inside the studio, Colbert finally spoke, but not to the audience. He looked down, then up, then directly into the lens. A pause, and then, "Ladies and gentlemen, that did not go how I expected." Scattered laughter, awkward, unsure. The audience was trained to laugh, conditioned, but their instincts were failing them now. Cleared his throat. "Look, I've done this show for years. I've sat across from presidents, actors, athletes, whistleblowers. And yes, I ask tough questions. That's my job. But sometimes those questions hit nerves I didn't know were there. He stood up from behind the desk, something he rarely did. What you just saw wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even comfortable. But maybe that's the point. The room quieted. I don't know what Mark Wahlberg came here expecting, but clearly he came here carrying something. Maybe I didn't give him the space to let it out, or maybe he just didn't want to wait for permission anymore. And then he did something no one expected. He turned to the audience. If you're watching at home, if you think I was too harsh, or too soft, or too smug, or too whatever, you're probably right. Maybe I was all of those things, but I've never claimed to be perfect. I claim to ask questions. A woman from the third row called out softly. Then maybe next time, ask to understand, not to trap. That shut the room down. Colbert blinked, and for the first time in a long time, he listened. 24 hours later, the media was a war zone. Cable news split into factions. Left-wing anchors condemned Wahlberg's outburst as performative rage. Right-wing pundits praised him as finally exposing liberal elitism on live TV. TikTok edits spliced Wahlberg's speech into emotional reels, over piano music and slow zooms. But the real moment came that evening, when Mark Wahlberg released a statement: no PR spin, no agent-filtered press release, just a handheld video, shaky natural light. He was sitting on a stoop in South Boston. No makeup, no mic. I didn't walk onto that stage looking for a fight. I walked on hoping for a conversation. Somewhere along the way, I realized we weren't having one. He paused. Stephen Colbert is one of the smartest guys on TV, but even smart guys can get it wrong. Hell, I've spent most of my life getting it wrong. That's why I try so hard now to get it right. But I'm human, and humans break. He looked directly into the lens. I'm not going to apologize for speaking my truth, and I'm not going to ask for yours. All I ask is if we're going to keep calling people out. Let's try calling people in. It's the only way forward. The video hit 25 million views in 6 hours. But what came next shocked everyone. Colbert responded, not through his show, not through a team. He tweeted a simple line. Maybe it's my turn to listen. Mark, come back. No cameras, no crowd. Just two guys talking. Wahlberg quote retweeted it with one word: ready. Back to the show, minus 3 days later, the studio looked the same, but at WASN. Single quotes that this time there was no band, no monologue, no cheering intro, just two chairs. No desk, no ego buffer. Wahlberg entered first. No suit, just jeans and a jacket. Then, Colbert, no cards in hand, no intro music. They sat, looked at each other. Wahlberg spoke first. You sure about this? Colbert nodded, not even a little. They both smiled, not fake, real dot, and then they talked, no yelling, no traps, just two men trying to understand the cracks in each other's armor. They talked about guilt, about ego, about the difference between character and image, about how hard it is to stay human when the world is watching, and for the first time in what felt like forever, America watched two men disagree, reflect, and find common ground by the end of the hour. There were no cheers, just a standing silence, not for entertainment, for grace. There was a stillness in the studio that night that couldn't be faked, not even with the best lighting team in television, not even with decades of Emmy-winning experience. Something had changed. For an hour, America had watched Mark Wahlberg and Stephen Colbert not as icons or performers, but as men, fallible, flawed, and frighteningly human. And now, as the credits were supposed to roll, neither of them stood. They stayed in their chairs, still talking, still listening. It was like the cameras had faded into the background, like they forgot this was being recorded, and that was the power of it. They weren't performing anymore. They were processing. A few hours later, BACKSD, Istvan stood alone in his dressing room. He wasn't looking in the mirror. He was staring at the empty guest chair across the room, the same chair where Mark had once erupted, the same chair that, just moments ago, held a man who'd poured his soul out in front of millions and gave him, the host, the grace to admit where he'd gone wrong. The door creaked open. It was John Batiste, former bandleader, old friend. John asked. Stephen turned slowly, his eyes damp but steady. "I think I've been doing this wrong for a while," he whispered. John stepped in, folding his arms. "Wrong how?" "I spent years making people laugh, making fun of the system, holding people accountable. But somewhere in that, I stopped being curious. I started trying to win." Every guest became a debate, every story a narrative. He looked back at the empty chair. Mark didn't come here to fight. He came to connect. John gave him a long, steady look. "Then maybe it's time to change the show." Stephen blinked. "Change it how?" John smiled. "Start by asking a question you don't already know the answer to." Elsewhere, Boston Mark Wahlberg sat in his kitchen, phone buzzing with texts from agents, producers, old co-stars. Offers were pouring in. Some saw the viral moment as a new franchise opportunity. Others, a comeback tour. He wasn't responding to any of them. Instead, he was staring at a photo on the fridge. It was old, grainy, a young version of him long before fame, standing next to his brother on a basketball court. Back then, the world didn't care what he had to say, and maybe that was the blessing. He picked up his phone, not to answer a call, but to make one. It rang twice. Then, hello. It was his brother Donnie. Mark exhaled. "I think I almost ruined everything," he said quietly. Donnie didn't miss a beat. "You didn't ruin anything. You shook the table." "There's a difference." Mark went silent. Donnie added, "You've always been the guy who walks away when it gets fake, but now you walked back in when it finally got real. That's growth." Mark smiled, but it was faint, burdened. I didn't expect it. To hurt this much, truth always does." 1 week later, CBS press release, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, will enter a new chapter. Deeper interviews, fewer segments, and a commitment to unfiltered, authentic conversations. It will no longer be entertainment at the expense of empathy. It will be truth in real time. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. One outlet called it a risky pivot into earnestness. Another called it career suicide, in a culture addicted to sound bites. But for the millions who'd watched the original Confrontation, it felt like the first real decision late-night television had made in years. A month later, a live town hall in Boston was unlike anything either of them had ever done before. No studio, no scripts, no audience, planted for applause, just a warehouse, full of folding chairs, locals, firefighters, nurses, former addicts, teachers, parents. Stephen and Mark sat on 2 stools, no platform, just eye level. The event was streamed online. No commercial breaks, no edits. The title, America Interrupted. A conversation between opposites. Mark opened with a story about his past, the one he usually avoids. The arrests, the anger, the mistakes. Then Stephen shared something he hadn't ever said publicly. How after his father and 2 brothers died in a plane crash, he didn't speak in school for months. How he learned to be funny to hide his pain, not heal it. The crowd didn't clap. They leaned in for 2 hours. They didn't agree on everything. Politics, faith, responsibility, but they didn't shout either. They passed the mic to audience members. And when a young man, clearly nervous, asked, "How do you speak up?" When nobody's listening, it was Mark who answered first. You don't wait for a stage. You find one person, one moment. You speak from here. He tapped his chest, and even if nobody listens that day, someone remembers it tomorrow. Stephen looked at him, then turned to the crowd. That's what happened between us. He spoke. I didn't listen. Then the world did, and now I'm trying to hear. The final moment backstage after the event, Mark and Stephen sat alone in folding chairs. Both looked exhausted. But lighter. Stephen broke the silence. You know this doesn't erase what happened, right? Mark nodded. It shouldn't. That's not the point. Stephen looked over. You regret it? Waiting so long to say it. A long pause. Stephen stood up, walked to the door, hand on the knob, then turned back. We should do this again. Mark smiled. Thought you'd never ask. Stephen smiled back, then left. Cut to black. Text on screen. Sometimes it takes a breakdown to begin a breakthrough. Sometimes it takes a public confrontation to begin a private healing. And sometimes it takes 2 people from different worlds to remind us that real conversation still matters. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, subscribe. And if you believe real talk still has a place in our world, like this video, leave a comment and stay with US, because this is only the beginning.